Did you know that one small act can change the mood of an entire crowd? On a flight filled with impatience and complaints, Barron Trump took a step that touched every heart. This story will not only move you, but also remind you of the true meaning of respect and sacrifice. Would you stay silent if a fallen hero was disrespected, or would you rise to defend their honor? On one unforgettable flight, Barron Trump made a choice that left everyone speechless. The boarding process for Flight 729 to Washington, D.C. was in motion. Passengers shuffled down the aisle, stowing their bags and adjusting their seats. Amid the usual hum of pre-flight chatter, the cabin crew paused, glancing outside the small windows. A black hearse had pulled up alongside the plane on the tarmac. An honor guard solemnly unfolded an American flag, draping it over a casket. Inside the aircraft, a brief silence hung as a few passengers noticed what was happening. A crew member quietly explained over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a short delay while we honor a fallen soldier being transported to their final resting place in Washington, D.C." The gravity of the moment wasn't lost on most, but not everyone shared the sentiment. A man in a sharply pressed suit scoffed audibly, muttering, "This is ridiculous. We've got schedules to keep." A younger woman nearby chimed in, "Why couldn't they do this after we left? Some of us have places to be." Their voices cut through the stillness, drawing uneasy glances from other passengers. Whispers began to ripple across the rows. Some passengers looked visibly uncomfortable, others exchanged disapproving looks. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, shielding her ears from the harsh remarks. The honor guard stood at attention, their movements deliberate and respectful, but inside the cabin, tension simmered. Little did anyone know, a young man in the back row was about to step into the moment and shift the narrative entirely. The plane's interior felt unusually tense. Overhead bins clicked shut, and seatbelts snapped into place as flight attendants moved briskly, trying to keep the process running smoothly. Outside, the honor guard reached the aircraft door, carefully carrying the flag-draped casket into the cargo hold. Seated near the middle of the cabin, the man in the suit leaned back with a dramatic sigh. "This is taking forever," he grumbled loudly enough for those around him to hear. His impatience seemed to fuel others. A woman 2 rows behind whispered, "What's the big deal?" "It's not like the soldier knows we're waiting." A ripple of uncomfortable reaction spread across the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some looking down at their phones as if to escape the moment. An elderly woman near the window dabbed her eyes with a tissue, whispering softly to the man beside her, "That could have been my grandson." In the back row, a tall young man sat quietly, his presence mostly unnoticed until now. His name was Barron. Though his face might have been familiar to a few, he hadn't drawn attention to himself. Dressed simply in a dark jacket, he leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. He wasn't with the main group of passengers when they boarded. Instead, he had entered discreetly with a security detail, taking the rearmost seat away from the crowd. He wasn't looking at his phone or fiddling with his belongings like so many others. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the window where the honor guard completed their task. With the solemnity and care the moment deserved, the honor guard continued their task. But the murmurs of impatience in the cabin grew louder, and Barron Trump knew this moment demanded more than silence. The tension in the cabin became palpable. A man a few rows ahead stood up, addressing a flight attendant. "Look, I'm sorry, but I've got a connection to make. How much longer is this going to take?" His tone was not just impatient, it bordered on disdain. The flight attendant, her professionalism unwavering, responded gently, "Sir, this process should only take a few more moments. We appreciate your patience as we honor a fallen service member." Her words, however, didn't seem to resonate. The man scoffed, sitting back down with an audible mutter. A few passengers around him smirked in agreement, exchanging knowing glances, as if the delay was a personal inconvenience. The woman from earlier chimed in again, her voice sharp. "This is why airlines are a mess. They cater to these over-the-top gestures instead of sticking to schedules." It was as though the disrespect fed on itself, emboldening those who shared the sentiment. What was once a solemn stillness in the cabin had transformed into a buzz of low-level discontent. Near the front of the plane, a veteran stiffened in his seat, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. The elderly woman by the window clutched her tissue tighter, shaking her head in dismay. Barron, seated in the back, continued to watch quietly. His gaze swept across the disgruntled passengers, and he glanced briefly at his security detail seated a few rows ahead. They appeared neutral, their faces unreadable. But Barron's expression darkened as the honor guard's movements reflected faintly in the window beside him. When the final murmurs of disrespect echoed through the cabin, Barron made a decision that would change the atmosphere entirely. The aircraft had grown restless, the undercurrent of discontent weaving through the rows. From his seat in the back, Barron Trump leaned forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the seat in front of him. His presence, nearly invisible until now, began to shift. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate but calm. The rise of his 6-foot-plus frame caught the attention of a nearby passenger, who turned to look. Recognition spread quickly through the cabin, and whispers of, "Is that Barron Trump?" rippled through the rows, blending with the undercurrent of impatience. Barron cleared his throat, not loudly, but just enough to cut through the noise. His voice, steady and firm, carried a weight that immediately commanded attention. "Excuse me," he began, his tone calm but authoritative. "I'd like to say something." The murmurs ceased almost instantly. Heads turned, and passengers who had been vocal about their displeasure shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the man in the suit, the loudest voice of dissent, looked over his shoulder, his expression suddenly wary. "I understand everyone's in a hurry," Barron continued, his hands resting on the back of the seat in front of him. "But that casket down there belongs to someone who made the ultimate sacrifice for this country. Someone who gave up their schedule, their future, their life, so the rest of us could have the freedoms we enjoy." His words hung in the air, each syllable precise, each pause intentional. The plane had gone completely silent, save for the faint hum of the engines. But Barron wasn't done. He had more to say. Barron's gaze swept across the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers one by one. "You don't have to know their name or their story," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What matters is the respect they deserve, not just for their sacrifice, but for the countless sacrifices made by so many others like them." His words carried a weight that silenced even the most impatient passengers. The man in the suit shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Barron's eyes. The young woman who had spoken earlier glanced down at her hands, avoiding the stares of those around her. Barron continued, his tone softening but no less powerful. "I think we can all spare a few minutes to honor someone who can no longer speak for themselves. They've given far more than any of us will in these few moments of waiting." The cabin crew exchanged glances, visibly moved. Even the veteran near the front of the plane, who had remained silent until now, turned slightly in his seat, his expression softening. And then, in an unexpected gesture, Barron did something no one anticipated. He reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a small American flag. Holding it carefully, he walked to the middle of the aisle and placed it on the empty seat nearest to the window, directly above where the casket rested below. "This seat belongs to them," he said simply, stepping back. His words carried an almost sacred finality, and the simplicity of his act spoke louder than anything else. What happened next was beyond what anyone could have predicted. The plane seemed to hold its breath. Barron's gesture reverberated through the cabin, leaving no room for further complaints. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The flag, resting on the empty seat, became a poignant symbol, visible to all and impossible to ignore. The veteran near the front stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. "Son," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "thank you for reminding us what's important." He gave Barron a respectful nod before placing his hand over his heart. Others began to follow, standing or sitting straighter, their hands mimicking the veteran's gesture. The man in the suit, who had been so vocal earlier, glanced around at the sea of solemn faces. His bravado seemed to dissolve under the weight of the moment. I. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, he stammered, his voice barely audible. The young woman beside him turned red, her earlier annoyance replaced with visible guilt. But it wasn't just shame that filled the cabin. Something deeper was happening. A teenage boy in a hoodie, who had been quietly watching from a window seat, removed his earbuds and muttered, That's. that's cool. His voice filled with newfound respect. A mother whispered something to her child, who looked at Barron with wide, curious eyes. The cabin crew, touched by the unfolding scene, moved with reverence as they finalized preparations for takeoff. One flight attendant walked over to Barron, her voice soft as she said, Thank you for doing that. It means more than you know. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, a hushed reverence filled the cabin. Passengers sat in reflective silence, each one deeply moved. Barron's words and gesture had transformed the atmosphere entirely. What had started as a moment of impatience and discontent had become an unforgettable tribute, cementing itself in the hearts of everyone on board. The earlier impatience in the cabin had been replaced with quiet introspection. Outside the window, the honor guard stood resolutely, saluting as the aircraft began to taxi. Against the backdrop of the setting sun, their figures were a powerful reminder of the solemnity of the moment. Mid-flight, the pilot made an announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your patience earlier. We are carrying the remains of a fallen soldier today, and it is a solemn honor to have them aboard. Let us take a moment of silence to reflect and pay our respects. Without hesitation, the entire cabin complied. Heads bowed, hands clasped, and eyes closed. Each passenger seemed to feel the weight of the moment in their own way. The man in the suit who had earlier voiced his annoyance now sat somberly, his hands clasped together. The young woman who had joined in his complaints wiped away a tear. At the back of the plane, Barron sat quietly, his focus steady. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. His intention was simply to remind everyone of the value of respect and sacrifice. His security detail exchanged subtle glances, acknowledging the young man's composure with quiet pride. When the plane landed in Washington, D.C., the mood aboard was markedly different. Passengers remained seated as requested, watching silently as the honor guard retrieved the casket and carried it from the aircraft with dignity. A ripple of applause began, soft at first, then swelling into a powerful, unified expression of gratitude. Barron didn't join in the clapping. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart, a small but deeply meaningful gesture. As passengers exited the plane, many carried something far more significant than their luggage, a renewed understanding of honor and respect. The earlier frustration and impatience had dissolved, replaced by quiet thoughtfulness. Some exchanged soft words with the cabin crew, while others nodded to Barron as they passed, their faces expressing gratitude and respect. The man in the suit paused at the exit, hesitated, then turned back to Barron. You were right, he said softly. I needed that reminder. Barron nodded, his expression calm but resolute. The young woman followed shortly after, whispering a heartfelt, Thank you. Outside, on the tarmac, the honor guard loaded the casket into a waiting hearse. A small group of onlookers, including the soldier's grieving family, stood nearby, their faces a mixture of pain and pride. Many passengers lingered at the airport windows, watching the scene unfold. In that moment, they were no longer businessmen, tourists, or weary travelers. They were witnesses, united by a collective reminder of sacrifice and respect. As Barron quietly left the terminal with his security detail, he glanced back once, taking in the sight of strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, moved by the power of a simple act. This wasn't just a story about a fallen soldier. It was a story about the importance of respect, for those who give everything and for moments that demand our attention, no matter how inconvenient they may seem. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on the sacrifices of others. Let's carry forward the lessons of humility and gratitude, one small gesture at a time. And don't forget to share this message. It's one the world needs to hear. Subscribe for more stories that inspire and remind us of what truly matters.